Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is Matt.
And my name is James.
And this week on the show, the theme we're looking at is alien intervention. We've taken two time travel films that throw a bit of a spanner in the time travel works and introduce another sci-fi topic, aliens visiting our time travelers and interfering with their time travel in some way. So what's the first film that we're looking at this week, James?
So the first film we're going to be looking at is Flight of the Navigator from 1986. A childhood classic for a lot of you, I'm sure. So we're going to be taking a look at that. And the second film we're going to be having a look at is Slaughterhouse-Five from 1972.
Two starkly different films here, but both examples of aliens meddling with time travelers' adventures in quite different ways as well. We'll get into that as we go along. So should we get started with Flight of the Navigator, James?
Yeah, let's get stuck in.
David, what time did you enter the woods?
Around 8 o'clock.
Then what happened?
Then I reached this cliff.
It's transmitting in alpha waves with complex frequency patterns in them.
I know I fell.
It's 1986, man. 8 years since that night. This is totally rad. I mean, you're my big little brother.
I think you should take a look at this. Where did this come from? From the mind of a 12-year-old boy?
So Flight of the Navigator from 1986. This is directed by Randall Kleiser, who also directed Honey, I Blew Up the Kid, the best of the Honey, I X'd the Y franchise, I'm sure, and Grease, a real classic musical. You referred to this in the intro as a childhood classic, James. What are your memories of this film?
It's one of those ones which was like, again, taped it off the TV. And there's I didn't remember too much about what happened in this, but I remembered vividly like stuff like the alien creatures on the ship and those bits. And I remember there was a long build up in the film to actually going anywhere. But we'll get into that when we fully sort of dissect this film. But yeah, I do have a lot of sort of like fond memories about it. I know a lot of people which hold this film quite close to their hearts because it's one which... It's like it's an easy to view family film, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very cute and sweet and very easily digested. I think my memories of it are similar to yours, really. It's a bit of a rainy day movie for me when I was a kid. And I remember all the same bits, the little puppets that live on the ship and the AI character just become really wacky and crazy and funny. That was all the stuff that I remembered. I have to say, I agree with you. I didn't remember how long it took to get into things in this film. All the stuff that I remember and love about the film happened in like the last 20 minutes, and that wasn't how I remembered it. But it didn't seem to bother me when I was a kid, so I guess I'll give it a pass on that. It was interesting to watch the parts of the film at the start that kind of deal with other themes and what's going on with the main character as he wakes up in this world. He's a real fish out of water time traveller, isn't he? Like other ones that we've looked at recently.
Yeah, definitely. He's really got that. He's sort of like he's an involuntary time traveller, isn't he? But this film as well, because like we said, it's like a family film. I didn't realise it was Disney.
Yeah, I didn't know that either. It's one of those Disney live-action adventures. And when you realise it's Disney, it does fit into quite a few of the films they were putting out at this time, doesn't it? But I wasn't aware of it because it never became one of their big properties, and it's not really... So they go back to the well quite a lot with their intellectual property, and they haven't really done it with this one, have they?
Yeah, because I think with this one as well, I think it was originally supposed to be an independent film. And then Disney bought the rights to it.
Oh, right.
And from there, they sort of like started distributing it and that kind of thing. So it's interesting that they picked this particular film as well, because it is like, it's very sci-fi heavy, isn't it?
Yeah, it kind of cashes in on the E.T. Mania in the 80s. There's a little ET joke about halfway through or towards the end. Some hillbilly says about David, he said he wanted to phone home. So they're owning that a little bit, that it's cashing in on that fad at the time.
Yeah, it's like Aliens were sort of like big business round about this time, weren't they? Because like you said, E.T. was one of the biggest films that had been out for like family viewing. So yeah, so this is sort of like, it does sort of cash in on all that kind of stuff. So we noticed as well that it's got lots of different sci-fi topics in there. So all the themes, and a lot of the themes we've covered previously on the podcast.
Yeah, it picks up on AI. Obviously, we had a series on AI. Max, the character that's piloting this ship that David is abducted by, is an artificial intelligence there. And it kind of gets into the kind of melding of brains that we saw in stuff like Ghost in the Shell, way back when we covered that, when David and Max have this kind of mind transfer and it affects Max's personality. Obviously, we've got space travel. That's the main element of the film that takes David away. And then we get into themes of time travel as well, which is what we're looking at now. It also, we haven't touched on, we haven't had a series on aliens yet, but this kind of gets into that. But the aliens are kind of hidden away, aren't they? Well, we see the puppets on the ship, but the Phalons themselves, the main aliens that abduct David, are slightly strangely nowhere to be seen in the film.
Yeah, you don't really get a sense of what they're like. Like, I know when I was a kid, I always assumed that the ship was one of these Phalons, but it doesn't seem to be like that, does it? When like you watch as an adult and you kind of like watch it again.
No, Max is programmed by the Phalons, and he's just like some sort of assistant, and his mission is just to go out there and essentially create a little zoo for study that he's going to take back to the Phalons, and they're going to study them, or he might do all the study on board the ship. Oh no, they definitely take them back to Phalon, don't they? Because that's what's caused the time dilation that affects David. So they're going to Phalon to be studied, and then just return back where they found them, which all seems kind of fine and dandy. But then it gets a bit more complicated because Max has got to return them back to where they came from. So we've got the one method of time travel that brings David to the future, which is time dilation, that we've looked at. What's Max's plan for returning them all? He kind of mentions it offhandedly. I'm just going to drop them off all back where I got them from. What's the plan there?
Yeah, it's a weird one, isn't it? Because he says he's going to drop them back, but he says normally what he does is he drops them back at the exact moment where he took them in the first place. So it feels like no time has passed for them. But there's also like a bit of a contradiction in that, because there's the little alien creature that he has, and he says he can't take him back to where he was because his planet's gone now. So I don't know if Max took him at the moment it was about to explode or something weird like that. But from what we gather from his like sort of monologue about it, is he's going to take all these alien creatures that they're studying and he's going to drop them back at the same time.
Yeah, the Phalons are taking on an awful lot of responsibility in this film, aren't they? And because we don't actually see any Phalons, we don't really get the opportunity to judge them for assuming this role of responsibility. I found that quite interesting, because it all seems fine and dandy with we'll just return them, but like you said, then they've got responsibility for this life form that's the last of its kind, and things go pretty horribly wrong for David, who's been abducted. Things have gone wrong. They're not able to return a human back in time. So what puts them in this position of responsibility, I'm not quite sure. And it adds a bit of moral complexity to the film, in my opinion.
What are they doing here?
After I drop you off, I will travel back in time and take them to their homes, just as if they never left.
So let's talk a little bit more about David and what happens to him in the film then. So he's your ordinary 12-year-old kid. He's just sort of like, you see him at the start with his dog playing frisbee, all sort of like family fun. He's got an annoying kid brother. He's sort of like always calling him names and stuff. And then he ends up in this really weird predicament because he goes to find his brother in the woods to try and get him home because he's gone to a friend's house. And there's one, so initially the time travel in this looks like what we saw in a Connecticut Yankee. It looks like he got a bonk on the head and suddenly he's in the future. And it takes a long time for the film to explain what's happened in the first place. So for whatever reason, David is walking around in the woods and then he slips, he falls, he wakes up, goes back to his house, and there's this old couple there, and then his parents are nowhere to be found. Now that's quite a terrifying sort of time travel bit to put in a kid's film as well, just to sort of wake up and be like, right, my parents aren't there. I don't know what's going on. It is quite a terrifying concept, isn't it?
It's a terrifying concept, but it makes for a really great scene, I thought, because what we've noticed is that these films can't really, as a matter of function, they just can't really dwell on the sheer trauma of traveling in time, of waking up in a new timeline, or waking up and discovering that everyone you've ever known has died or whatever. Planet of the Apes did quite a good job of it with one of the characters, but these films can't spend a lot of time on it unless that's the point of the film, because it'd be really depressing. But it's always great when a kid's movie has those scenes that are like genuinely scary, you know, put a bit of fear into the kids watching it. And it doesn't have to last forever, but it creates a powerful moment in the film and a powerful memory. And that scene of David going home and this old couple that lives there and everything's just messed up and weird, it's very traumatizing, and it gets past that moment of dealing with the terror of slipping through time and explaining it quite effectively and efficiently, and then the film's kind of able to move on from that and get on with the story.
Yeah, and I think it is that terror of time travel as well, because as much as we've looked at it in a few films now where it's been quite fun, we have also seen the sort of darker side of it where things go wrong, and sort of like it's the ultimate getting lost. Because like when we talked about space in the space series, we talked about sort of the abyss of space and getting lost in there. It's also terrifying getting lost in time, because you get lost in a point where you can't get back to where you were supposed to, and you've got this, everything like on the surface looks the same, but because time has passed either forwards or backwards, it's all different. So you might be stuck in the same place, but the changes just make everything that much more harder to deal with. Yeah,
you stand to lose all the same things that you would if you were lost in space, but you have to live in this sort of twisted mirror reality of the reality that you've lost, and sort of live with being confronted by, like you said, this world that looks similar, but your loved ones aren't there or they've changed. There's not necessarily an extra level, but a different layer of terror to it about being lost in time compared to being lost in space.
Yeah, and we talked about, when we looked at Back to the Future, we talked about the idea of having a sort of like a different timeline. In this, you sort of see a bit of that initially, just with the fact that his brother is older. So he says like, my big little brother to him and things like that. So it's like, they're the same people you left, but you've been away for so long, they're completely different now, to the point where he can barely recognize his brother because he's grown up now. He's like, 16? So yeah, so he's a completely different person to the annoying kid who used to call him names previously. And it's like getting to know his family again. It's a really sort of like weird thing to sort of have in a kid's film. But I think that it's important to have kids' films like this where they've kind of got that terror aspect to them, because I think it's important as a kid to watch things that sort of do freak you out a little bit, because you need to sort of like have that element in your life. You can't just sort of like watch everything with kid gloves. You have to have like something which does freak you out a bit, which I'm sure this film did to a lot of people watching it as kids. So yeah, I love all that sort of aspect in it. Yeah,
all fiction is a good way for everyone of any age to kind of process the world around them, isn't it? And that's equally as true for fiction that is written for kids as it is for adults. And yeah, I agree. It's helpful to process these scary moments in a relatively sort of comfortable, safe bubble of your living room and the bubble of the rest of the film itself, and dealing with that kind of fear in that safe environment. I think it's good. It certainly didn't do me any harm watching this several times when I was 10 or whatever. So yeah, I'm in favour of that kind of storytelling for children's films. I think that is also captured really well by the actors playing the core family unit. So David is excellent. Joey Kramer, who plays David, the navigator, is a very, very talented child actor in this film, and the film wouldn't work without him. But also, you were talking about the 16-year-old brother who's aged 8 years, and now he's a teenager, and the parents as well. They all do such a good job of conveying this strange and terrifying moment of David coming back to them 8 years later, but mixing that in with obviously the happiness of being reunited with a child who vanished 8 years ago. It's such a difficult thing. It must be a difficult thing for an actor to do. And they all do it so convincingly and so well. And that really helps hold this entire film together. It's also really important to sell the time travel aspect as well, because as we've talked about before, time travel is such a difficult concept to wrap your head around. It's quite far-fetched and unbelievable, but this family is faced with undeniably their 8-year-old son. He looks identical to the way he did 8 years ago. It's unmistakably David. And with that recognition that it's David, we can all kind of move past the time travel and accept that time travel has happened to this character.
Will this hurt?
You will feel nothing.
Will I remember everything?
You will retain all data.
How many times have you done this thing?
0.
0? You mean never? I'm not gonna let you try this out on me. What if you fry my brain?
I will not fry your brain.
How do you know?
I have been programmed with superior intelligence. Lie down.
Okay.
So it's interesting, this sort of particular type of time travel as well, because it is so associated with like alien intervention. Like, did you ever see the 4400 when that was out?
No, I never watched that one.
Yeah, so that whole thing was like, there's so many people which have been abducted by aliens over the years, and then suddenly 4,400 of them are just plonked back at this one moment in time. And then some of them have sort of like powers and things like that. But I feel like I've seen this a lot, this idea of like an alien abduction, but then time passing. And I think that's quite a common thing.
Yeah. Is it also what happens in Taken? It's been a while since I've seen Taken, but that deals with a lot of alien abductions within one family. And I think there's a bit of a gap in between their abduction and their return.
Yeah, I think it does have moments where it's like there's time missing for people and more time has passed than they think, or less time. So, yeah, this idea of time travel and having a connection to aliens, I think, well, it's a very big sort of sci-fi concept, and it's often linked.
Yeah, and it's a popular trait of, real life accounts of being abducted by aliens. People will have this, they'll black out, or they'll have a gap in their memory, like you said. And I guess this film, they're using David to kind of extend the logic of that concept and say, well, what if it had happened for 8 years, a longer period of time, and what would the effect be on that family and on that child? Yeah,
and the way they explain it as well is because Max, the ship, was traveling at the speed of light. So we've seen this when we talked about Star Trek previously, and we looked at sort of like wormholes and speed of light travel and that kind of thing.
And Planet of the Apes as well.
Yeah, and exactly, in Planet of the Apes. So this idea of if you go to the speed of light, then there's going to be some sort of time dilation. And yeah, I loved that whole idea in this. And so I had sort of Bill and Ted flashbacks. When you see Max traveling through the sort of like time warp, or whatever it is, traveling through the time warp, that sounds like a completely different thing. But yeah, there's a moment where he's traveling through, and then this idea of the sort of time stream, which you see in a lot of sci-fi films, this idea of like traveling through time and you're going through like a slipstream or something. There's lots of like lightning and thunder and these weird sort of like waves, and it's all dark. This sort of image of traveling through time is quite a common thing as well we see in sci-fi cinema. Just this vision of like you're physically traveling through somewhere in order to go back or forward in time.
Yeah, I think there might be two kind of things at work there, which is one, and we've seen it in other films a little bit, they talked about it at the start of The Time Machine, where one thing where it's a little bit difficult for humans to conceptualize the idea of time travel because we're very, most of us are very visual creatures, and we imagine things in our mind's eye. So traveling in time, it's quite hard to conceptualize in that way. And then the second problem kind of meeting that in films is that films have to present things visually. They're a visual medium. So we've got this problem of conceptualizing it in your own mind's eye, and then also bringing that to the screen in a way that will do the conceptualization on the audience's behalf and kind of create that image for them. So you get things like the circuits of time in Bill and Ted, the time warp, as you called it, in Flight of the Navigator. It reminded me also of when we looked at wormholes in our space series. We don't really know what the inside of a wormhole would look like, I assume. We covered in our space series the fact that we're not astrophysicists, but we don't know what that would look like, and it's hard to conceptualize. So the films have this big task to figure that out for us and sort that out on screen and make it make sense. In a traveling sense.
Yeah, and I think the idea of like a time stream or a time, like it's like having that sort of like comparison to water as well. I don't know if that's something that comes into it, because obviously in the world that we live in, you see things like rivers and they all connect from like estuaries and streams and that kind of thing. So this idea of the sort of like the different paths you could take sort of like all comes forward in a lot of visualizations of time travel as well.
Yeah, I think streams and rivers are helpful in the conceptualization of it because it also links it to like a powerful force of nature that travels in one direction that, a human being alone can't do anything about. It's going to happen with or without you, much the same way that we experience time in one direction, just traveling forwards. I think that's a helpful visual metaphor, and that's why you get these time streams and that kind of visual image in time travel films.
And also like because it's supposed to go one way, and if you're going against the current, then you've got this force that you're going up against. So that's, and all of the stuff you're talking about, sort of like the sort of the nature idea of it and natural forces. I think that's a very good way to sort of visualize this kind of thing, because it's the closest thing we have, like looking at the natural world. And speaking of looking at the natural world, that's exactly what causes all the problems in the first place, because Max, the talking spaceship, is looking at Daisy when he accidentally hits a bunch of cables. What is it? It's like a phone line or something, doesn't he hit?
Yeah, I can't remember what exactly he hits, but he basically just bumps into something and crashes the ship and completely derails it. Which I have to say I did quite like that, because having watched all of those AI films for our AI series, it was nice to see that little element of personality in Max that's something that's really focused on in a lot of AI movies. So obviously Max is going to swap brains or whatever it is he does with David and get this wacky Paul Rubens character personality that he has for the end of the film. But it was nice to see that there is that kind of trace of that in Max, because he's got a little hint of like whimsy about him. He will stop and look at daisies out of interest. Whether that's part of his programming or not, we don't really get into that. But we learn something about him as a character.
How did you find Max's voice, just in general? Because I found it really annoying when he switched into like his more characterized voice.
I think it was so embedded into my brain, because I really had seen this film a lot of times when I was a kid, that it just didn't bother me. I'm not a huge Paul Rubens fan. I definitely understand why someone would find, pretty much any character he does like quite grating and a little bit annoying. But yeah, I just love Max. It was kind of like the character that I remember from when I was a kid. I can't really explain it, because he's as annoying as the characters from Explorers, those aliens played by Robert Picardo, or Johnny Five from Short Circuit, who drove me completely insane when we watched that. But I don't know, it's so nostalgic for me, this one. And he doesn't do anything offensive, he's just being a bit silly. But you weren't into it.
Yeah, I don't know. I think it's because when I watched it again, I knew it was Paul Rubens. And I think, yeah, so I was like, I kept just picturing Pee Wee Herman, and it just threw me off for the rest of the film. But interestingly, though, Paul Rubens actually wanted to sort of like make sure this didn't happen when people watch the film. So that's why he's credited as Paul Moore in there as the voice actor rather than Paul Rubens, because he was worried that sort of like his identity as Pee Wee Herman and stuff would come through, and he wanted Max to be a bit more of a mystery to people.
Okay, but you're kind of implying that he did that so that people wouldn't be annoyed by Max's voice. I'm sure that wasn't his intention.
I mean, that's how it came across for me. But yeah, I'm sure that is not what he was doing it for. Obviously, just to be mysterious and be like, oh, this who's the voice actor for Max? Nobody knows because we've done some stuff to his voice.
The mysterious Paul Moore.
You are an inferior species, you dumb dork.
Butt face.
Ghost bucket.
Hey, well, if you're so perfect, what are you still doing here?
I told you, I blew a fuse when I totaled out that electrical tower. I was checking out some daisies.
Crashed while looking at flowers?
Ha!
Sounds like you're the inferior species.
I'll show you who's inferior. Heads up!
So when it comes down to it, this film, there's not like loads of stuff going on. It's quite a simplistic plot. You've got the villains, which are NASA in this. NASA are trying to get them, trying to unlock the mysteries of the ship. And Max and David manage to escape. They go on a bit of a journey around the country. He gets to drive the ship. It's all really fun. But it all comes down to David needs to get back to his own time. He doesn't feel like he's home at the moment. Even if he gets dropped off again, NASA are going to do weird experiments on him to find out all the stuff he knows. Because this is the thing as well. He's presumably got all of the information. He's been used as like a USB stick, hasn't he, by Max?
Yeah.
He's just got all of the navigating experience in his head, because they really lay into humans about in this film. So humans are too fragile to do time travel, and we use so little of our brains that you can use almost the rest. You can use the rest of it just to store your star charts in. So yeah. David, like, why is David even picked as well? He's just kind of like plucked out. They have a look at him. They store some charts in him, and then he gets stuck back there.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, isn't it? Because they don't get into that at all. David's not selected for any particular reason, is he? I think it's a time and place sort of situation for David. He happens to be in that ravine where he falls down, and that's where Max chose to descend and do his abduction in the dark of night where no one will see.
makes Max sound a lot more shady than initially. He's plucked this young boy away, taken him off to this weird planet, and looked at some daisies and fucked it all up.
But he does manage to take him back eventually. They sort out the time travel, and David is returned home, and we get a bit of a family-friendly version of the jacket, don't we? He's been to the future, but he's able to go back to the right past with all of this knowledge of the future. What do you think is left for David's timeline and the timeline that he's visited, and how's that going to reconcile? Because the film doesn't deal with any of that, of course. It just has a nice happy ending. Yeah,
that's a good point. Like, what kind of knowledge has David got now that he can take back? He knows sort of like what music's going to be like, so he could start a band and have a really successful band doing all the music which is going to be popular in the future. He knows Sarah Jessica Parker. Maybe he's going to try and look her up as a kid. He seemed like he was really into her when he was trapped in the NASA base. What other knowledge does he gain other than those bits? He doesn't gain too much, does he?
No, he doesn't. I think that's what makes him a good time traveler for a kids movie, is that he's very harmless, and we know that when him getting back to his family was such an important goal and just his driving force, that once that's achieved at the end of the film, that's proper resolution for that character, and there's no loose ends. I mean, that does also kind of mean that there's no room for a sequel, or less room for a sequel. Hence, maybe Disney not coming back to this property in the future. But it gives a nice sense of resolution, and it kind of underlines that happy ending for David when he's back together with his family in 1978.
And it's interesting that it's 1978 and 1986, because obviously the film was made in 1986. So everything that David considers to be the future is the present for the audience. So it's like, even in the span of 8 years, things have changed so much in sort of like popular culture that if you were to go forward 8 years, you'd be like, what the hell's going on? And especially in sort of like around about these times, it's interesting that, isn't it? That such a short space of time can cover so much change.
Yeah, it's got links to Back to the Future in that way, hasn't it? That when we looked at Back to the Future, they'd chosen 30 years as a good gap of time because it's kind of roughly one generation. And we're going to go 30 years into the past, and then in the second film we go 30 years into the future. So we see our parents, and then we'll see our kids, and it kind of works nicely. But within that 30 years, the world is just almost unrecognizable and culture's so different. And Flight of the Navigator is taking an even more little laser scalpel kind of view of that and just saying like, well, what's the difference been in 8 years' time? And it's, you know, the birth of MTV and music videos and Coca-Cola having lots of different types of Coca-Cola, you know, that maybe a little trivial, but to David it's pretty mind-blowing. And it's like, I don't recognize this world. There's a robot serving me Coke.
I mean, that was a bit bad.
Yeah, considering it didn't exist, I don't think, in 1986 to have a little trolley robot.
That did make me think of Rocky Five. Have you seen Rocky Five? And there's a robot in that Paulie gets for his birthday.
Is it like the Nintendo robot?
Oh, it's really weird. It's like he sort of like falls a bit in love with it because it's like his serving wench. And he's just...
Oh, no, I don't remember that at all.
Yeah, it's such a weird bit in that film. But yeah, it felt a bit like that. Like the 80s were a time when you would just put in a robot. Like in the Netflix show Glow, there's like a rich businessman in that, and he just has a robot serving drinks and stuff. Like totally impractical. It's probably just remote control, but this sort of like that time period when it was such a thing to do, you'd have these like fake robots about.
Yo, I wanted a sports car for my birthday. Not no walking trash can.
Oh, come on, he looks great here.
It's extremely psycho, Rocco.
Well, since you don't have any friends, we thought you'd like it.
Yeah, pretend you're happy, will you? It'll keep you company when you're all alone.
That's a great-looking guy.
Please make a wish.
It's creepy. That talks, that thing.
Creepy? These are great. I wish I had one of these when I was growing up. Come on, make a wish like he says.
I wish I wasn't in this nightmare.
Hey, very classy wish. Very nice. What do you think there? Very good, huh?
Was this film as sort of charming as you remember it? Did it have any sort of like weird connotations or anything watching it again as an adult, or was it just a smooth ride?
I think it was a fairly smooth ride. Obviously, the relationship between Sarah Jessica Parker and David is a bit weird. They kind of force it by her saying, "You're pretty cute," you know? And it was just like, well, you didn't need to do that. But they don't dwell too much on that, so it seemed pretty harmless. How about you? Is it aged okay for you?
Yeah, it was fun. It was like an enjoyable watch. It did take long, like I said, it took longer than I thought it did to get to sort of like the good stuff, the flying around in the spaceship and meeting the aliens and stuff. But it's good. It's like an enjoyable film. And I'd like forgotten a lot about the time travel concept in it as well. I've got to be honest. Like, I just remember the spaceship and sort of like all that element of it. But I do think the time travel in this is very interesting. And it's like, it's quite a heavy subject matter to put in a kid's film. But I think it worked out okay.
Yeah, it deals with leaping into the future unexpectedly quite well. So that was quite interesting to see, and I thought they handled that quite well. And it's also got a nice example of a time traveller who is completely involuntary, has been taken against his will, abducted even, and has no choice in the matter. And the next film we're going to be looking at has, I think, the ultimate example of an involuntary time traveller in its main character, Billy Pilgrim. Shall we move on to Slaughterhouse-Five?
Slaughterhouse-Five from 1972. Had you seen this film before?
No, I hadn't seen this film. I was familiar with the basic plots because I've read a different Kurt Vonnegut book, so I'd done a little bit of reading on this one as well. And the one I've read's got some weird links to this one. It's called The Sirens of Titan, where there's some character crossover, and the Tralfamadorians get involved in that book as well. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Have you seen this film before?
No, I went into this one pretty much blind, I've got to be honest. I knew very little about it. I hadn't really looked up sort of like much about the storyline. I knew that it involved time travel, and that was about it. So I didn't know what to expect. It's got quite a sort of like out there title, Slaughterhouse-Five. I was like, what's going to happen? Is there going to be like slaughtering? Is there going to be like 5 people doing stuff? But we will explain all as we delve into this film.
Schlachthof 5. This is Schlachthof 5. 5 is English 5. Schlacht is slaughter. Hof is house. Schlachthof 5. Slaughterhouse-Five. Your house.
So we talked about time travelers and sort of like how suitable they are to being time travelers. How do you feel about Billy Pilgrim? Like, where does he fit into what we consider a good time traveler to be?
When I was watching the film, I was trying to think about that in particular, because it's something that we've been talking about quite a lot in these episodes. How suitable is he as a time traveler? Because he's very relaxed and chilled out. We're introduced to this concept in the very first scene. He's in his middle age, and he's writing a letter to the editor of his local newspaper explaining his condition, which is that he's unstuck in time. He has no control over it. He experiences random moments from his life, the past and the future, just at any time. He might just pop into it. And that's quite a heavy concept, especially considering that he's a World War II veteran who witnessed the firebombing of Dresden in Germany. So he's seen some awful stuff. So that's the kind of stuff that he's flashing back to and experiencing. But he remains relatively calm. He's appropriately freaking out when he is in a war zone. But when it comes to the actual time hopping, he never seems to be panicked by it. And in that sense, he's really good as a time traveler. You need to keep a level head, like Billy the Kid in Bill and Ted, right? You need to deal with it with remarkable calmness, or whatever it is that they say to him. And he does do that. But at the same time, he's really passive. He doesn't do anything. Did you get the sense that he could even do anything when he was skipping about through time?
I wasn't sure for a lot of the film, like, because it starts off, the first real time travel bit you see is when the titles are coming up, and it flashes back from sort of like the moment you were talking about into the snow, and he's in the middle of the war, and he doesn't know where he is, and he says like, I don't know where I am, but we don't know where this is in his past. It could be that he's just been separated from his group or something like that. It's very sort of vague about that. And he doesn't really, for a lot of it, he doesn't really refer to the fact that he's traveling like in time, that he's skipping back and forth. And I think I got more of a grasp of this towards the end when you've got the conversation with the Tralfamadorians and their concept of time. They sort of talk about how they know how the world's going to end. They know how the universe is going to end, in fact. And they know there's going to be something to do with one of their pilots has some fuel, he'll press a wrong button, and then everything will be over. And they say, we've seen it, but we choose not to do anything about it. It has happened, it will always happen. So Billy's kind of got this same view of time skipping. So it's like, it feels like he has no sort of like agency. It feels like he can't do anything about these moments he's living. But it doesn't really sort of delve into that too much. I don't know if you get more of a sense of that in the book, because obviously for him, it must be kind of like, if I was traveling through time, skipping back and forth, I'd be panicking. But then if you were traveling into the past and you'd already lived that moment, would you even be conscious of it? It's really weird. It's like, it's quite a hard one to wrap your head around.
Yeah, I think it raises an important question as well that the film deliberately doesn't answer. And again, I don't know if the book might clarify this, but when does Billy start experiencing this? Has he been experiencing this for his entire life, as long as he can remember, or did it happen to him at some point? So what we see is him experiencing it retroactively. There's a scene midway through the film that I think we'll get to later where it's clear that he has already experienced it because he actually comments on what's happening and that he knows something's going to happen. And certainly later in life, he talks to his kids about seeing his own death. And when he's writing the letter to the editor, obviously. But when he's in World War II, it's a bit less clear. Is he experiencing the time tripping then, or is that just as a memory from him after the war?
Because there's two moments where you see the aliens sort of like get him. There's one when he's with his dog outside and this light comes to him and he sort of notices it. And then there's another one when he's in his bedroom and that's when he properly gets transported away and we see it. So, yeah, it's hard to tell if those are the first times it's happened because of the sort of like fractured nature of the film and the way it's telling the story. It's hard, yeah, you're right, it's hard to pinpoint exactly when, but you're only shown sort of, I think it's two moments when he's sort of taken away for the first time.
Well, I'm not even totally sure he is taken away the first time. He is visited. Something comes out of the sky, a star grows as he's looking up at the sky, and then I thought it just kind of flew away and left him alone. But I'm not too sure. I think it's important that we kind of sketch out Billy Pilgrim's life story because that is the plot of the movie. And it's kind of important to kind of decode that because a lot of the messages that the film and Kurt Vonnegut are saying are told through Billy's experiences, aren't they? So we see very, very little of his childhood. From what I can remember, there's only one scene of his dad throwing him in the swimming pool to force him to learn to swim. And that's just a couple of minutes and that's very brief. The majority of his past that we see, well, I probably shouldn't refer to it as his past because there is no present in the film, I guess, is there? But the majority of his life story, early life story, is made up of his experiences in World War II, where he was captured by the Germans. He had a relatively cushy prisoner of war experience to start off with. But then he's transported to Dresden shortly before the bombing of Dresden. So he witnessed the kind of horrors of that bombing. And then he came home. He went on to get married. He had, from what we see in the film, a very happy marriage. Became a very, very successful optometrist. He was in a plane crash. Then his wife died on the way to the hospital to see him after the plane crash. He is, at some point in that, abducted by aliens, forced to mate in like a alien zoo for their...
You say forced. It wasn't. It didn't seem that forced, did it? Because they like conjure up the woman of his dreams.
He is delivered like an erotic actress and somewhat forcibly asked to mate with her. But well, yeah, you're right. He doesn't take a lot of cajoling. And then he dies giving a speech about these aliens. And he knows that he's going to die. And in the speech, he's talking about the fact that he is going to die during the speech because he's seen it already because of his slipping through time. So that's his whole life story, right? Have I missed any major points for Billy?
That seems like, yeah, that's pretty much it.
That's the story we're told in Slaughterhouse-Five. And we're told it completely out of sequence, and it's very similar to Je t'aime, je t'aime, in that it's a non-linear story. We're bouncing around through that. All we have going in is that Billy has said in a letter in the first scene that he's experiencing this time-tripping, time-slippage phenomenon.
And each moment that passes in the film is sort of connected. So it is like a memory, isn't it? Like Je t'aime, je t'aime. So it will go from the moment where he finds a diamond to when he gave that diamond to his wife as a present for their anniversary. And it will cut from lots of bits like that because every moment seems to be him remembering something. So it's got a lot to do with memory as well, this one, hasn't it? Because his whole time travel experience is based on his memories and the memories of his life. So he's just flip-flopping around in his life. And to tell this kind of story in a non-linear way makes it a very interesting watch because the way you described it there, it's not how you're told it, like you said. You don't get told this story immediately. You know something bad happens to him in the war, but you don't know exactly what it is. And then suddenly it'll tell you, and then it'll go back, but you never actually see it. And you've got this like dread about the bombing of Dresden in 1945, which we know he was there for. So a lot of it is sort of like based around that one particular moment. And we've seen this in time travel films where there's one moment in someone's life where they go back to continuously, or there's like a sense of dread about that moment, something that you couldn't foresee or change, or something that you want to change. There's that moment. And for Billy, it seems like that moment in Dresden was the moment, because like you said, he was having an all right time in the sort of like in the prisoner of war camps that took before that. And they really sort of like really delve into this in the sort of like anti-war nature of the film as well. Because when you're first introduced to Dresden, I didn't fully get this when I was watching it. I was like, oh, why are they showing Dresden for so long? They spend a good 15 minutes or something just showing you the scenery of Dresden, showing you the people, and then they're really sort of building this picture up of what life was like there before this horrendous bombing, which just like wiped everyone out. He's constantly thinking about that moment, which changes the sort of course of his life after that.
They don't just spend that time showing the beauty of Dresden. There's also that really vibrant, rich classical music playing underneath that scene. And it ends with Billy literally being slapped out of that moment. A member of the public in Dresden sees him taking it all in and kind of interacting with children in Dresden. And a German guy walks up to him and slaps him in the face and tells him off. And he obviously hates the Allies and doesn't like these prisoners of war, and certainly doesn't like them interacting with people. So you get this moment of Billy's memories of Dresden before the bombing, and then he is violently snapped out of that by remembering being violently slapped, and that takes him out of that picturesque little daydream that he's having. I like that you said that there's this sense of dread about Dresden as well, and how important it is in Billy's personal history. That the film, the way it's presented, I think by the time this film came out, Dresden would have been, people would have known what happened to Dresden and what the Allied forces did to Dresden, which is completely level it, and it wasn't necessarily a military target. And a lot of civilians died. They make that very clear in the film. In case you didn't know, his mother comments on it. So we get a little flash of him in a psychiatric hospital after the war, and his mother just explains to the other patient there and to the audience, he was in Dresden, he saw it get bombed. So we know that's coming. So that dread that you mentioned, we have to live with that as well. And we're experiencing that at the same time as Billy, who is being sent back in time to relive these memories, and presumably feeling all that dread of just knowing that this awful thing that he had to witness is going to happen again before his eyes, because he's got no control over his time travel ability. It's very tragic, isn't it?
Yeah, it is really tragic. And they sort of like hammer that home with other moments as well, because you know that his friend's going to get shot as well. So you sort of like see that coming. And then when you see him survive the bombing of Dresden, you're like, oh, maybe it doesn't happen here. And then shortly after, he's grabbing like a small ornament that he's found, and then without warning is just like put up in front of a firing squad, just like really quickly. So it's all these moments just quite sudden. Yeah,
it's another thing that we have to dread, and we have to experience that dread along with Billy. Because again, I think his wife mentions in a flash forward, or at a scene set after the war, that Billy lost his best friend, and that's quite early in the film as well. And I think that might even be before Darby, his best friend, is introduced to the film. So we have to experience that beginning of their friendship and them getting to know each other. And there's a really sweet scene where they're talking about what they did before they joined up, why they joined up. Billy was drafted, which I thought was interesting, because it's kind of like a passive way for him to enter the war. He didn't choose to do it, though he says that he would. But yeah, we have to watch this friendship developing, knowing that he's going to lose this friend at some point, but we don't know the details of it because Billy doesn't want to talk about it in the future. He declines to give the details of his friend's death, understandably.
And did you feel like there was a sense of like him trying to escape his past in any sort of way? Because obviously there is that dread you feel as an audience member watching it. Is it that he's, because they when he's flashing forward, we say flashing forward, when he's on the planet, the woman that he's talking to says, you find it quite painful doing these time skips or time tripping or whatever it is. And is sort of like Billy trying to escape these moments or trying to get over them in some way?
Personally, I don't think so, because I see him as a bit of a passive character. I think it's, for us, the audience, I do think it's to drive home that anti-war message, that it's the horror of war by presenting it as something that you know is going to be horrible, and you are forced to relive it as a war veteran like Billy would do, dealing with those memories. I don't think he is trying to fight against it, because that wouldn't work as well for that message. It has to be a kind of message of something that you can't resist and you can't do anything about to have that impact. Do you think he was trying to work against it in any way?
Maybe he's not trying to sort of like work against it, but maybe he's trying to sort of make sense of it, because you know how like you do linger on things like from your past sometimes, and you think about like, oh, what if I'd done things slightly differently? He's like trying to make sense of why this horrific thing happened to him. And then more things, and there's more moments which are quite horrific in his story as well. Like there's the plane crash, which you mentioned earlier, that he sort of like foresees. He sort of like skips. This is the only this is where the sort of time travel gets a bit fuzzy, because he gets on the plane and he sees the skiers who find him when the plane crashes. So what did you think about that moment?
Yeah, I actually watched the film a second time because I really enjoyed it. And having discussed Je t'aime with you last week, thinking about these non-linear films, I think they do really reward a second viewing. So I watched it again, and that scene with the plane crash, and so he's on a plane, and he sees some weird guys in weird ski masks, and he suddenly says to his friend, this plane's going to crash in 25 minutes. And then, we find out that he knows that because the guys in ski masks will be the guys that rescue him from the snow. And I think it's the only moment in the film where that happens, where that kind of bleeding of memories into the time travel becomes quite hard to distinguish. And that makes it a really interesting moment. And I didn't quite know what to make of it, I guess. But the plane crash in itself is really interesting in Billy's life story, because it's not foreshadowed, or it's not foreshadowing what they do in the film. They say he was at Dresden, he witnessed the bombing, and his best friend died. They just say that up front, and we have to then let that play out. But no one mentions the plane crash, I don't think, before it happens on screen. And then as a consequence of the plane crash, his wife dies. So he has these two awful traumatic events right at the same time, completely linked together, but we're not told about it beforehand as the audience, like we were with his earlier traumatic events. They're the first thing that really happens as a shock to the audience, even though they're not a shock to Billy, I assume, because he knows that the plane is going to crash. He must also know that his wife's going to die as a consequence of that.
It was very difficult, but he came through in good shape.
Dad, he's going to be all right.
It's wonderful.
Did you find Mother?
Well, it's crazy, Barbara. I don't understand.
What's crazy, Stanley? Where's Mama?
Come on, honey. Let's sit down. Well, listen. I think we'll take care of your father till he's able to take care of himself.
What do you mean, Stanley? What are you talking about?
Well, I looked all over for your mom, and then I asked one of the nurses, and they said that she died about 3 hours ago. So I had to find out if it was the right one. And it was. She was.
But when his wife dies as well, this is another sort of a foggy area in the film. So throughout the film, we've seen it from Billy's perspective, haven't we? We've seen all of these moments where he's been. And then you're shown a scene where his wife is driving her car on her own to get to the hospital. So Billy can't have been reliving that moment. So that's kind of like where it got a bit funny for me, because I wasn't quite sure how Billy was experiencing that, whether it was like a memory or... Because he wouldn't have been there, would he?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. It might literally be the only point in the film where we're not spatially aligned to Billy. I mean, Billy's not like on screen all the time, but he's in the scene. He's in the location where the scene is set, I think, for every single other scene, maybe.
Yeah.
And that's quite a long scene where... So his wife, she has this explosive period of grief where she has to get to the hospital where Billy is after the crash, and she just loses it and just drives all over the motorway and causes a load of accidents, and
her exhaust falls off, doesn't it? And then she gets carbon monoxide poisoning.
Yeah, so of all the accidents that she causes, it's the carbon monoxide poisoning that kills her. But it lasts a really long time, and you're right, Billy's got nothing to do with it, so he's not experiencing that in terms of time travel. And it's a little bit hard to explain it with the kind of knowledge that we have about what Billy's experiencing.
Yeah, it's a really strange scene, that. But I mean, they must have been conscious about it, because the film's so tight with its sort of like storytelling. That must have been a deliberate thing. I don't know if it's because it is such an important moment in his life. It needed some sort of visualization for it, and that was the only way of doing it. And maybe again, it's something that they sort of like bring out more in the book. Maybe it comes out in that, and that's the way that it's initially intended for.
Either way, at that point in his life, we can be pretty confident that whenever the time slippage started for Billy, it was happening to him then, because he was aware that the plane was going to crash. So that kind of helps him deal with the grief and the trauma of the plane crash, because he knew it was going to happen. He's been there before. He'd experienced it as a flash forward, so he's also presumably able to deal with his wife dying and the grief of that, because he'd already had time to accept that, I guess. And again, it's I think it goes back to the traumatic events of Dresden, right? The fact that he experienced this trauma. So I think you can take the time travel element out of Billy's life and say that he's someone who experienced trauma in the war, and that horrible trauma was so great that other traumas that happened to him later in life are not as impactful on him, because he's had to go through something so awful. So regardless of the fact that he's re-experiencing it through time travel, I think that what it's saying there is that that's the effect that traumatic experiences have on a person, and those memories change your psychology a little bit for the rest of your life, right?
That's a really good point, because it is like you said, he does have those other tragic moments in his life, specifically the plane crash, but the film isn't titled The Plane Crash or the sort of like The Trip to a Weird Planet. It's titled Slaughterhouse-Five, which is the place where he was in Dresden, like this old disused slaughterhouse where he lived as a prisoner of war. So it's constantly focusing on that specific moment and the trauma that he has from living in that time, and then how it changed him after that.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, we only get that one childhood scene, and it's horrible. It's being thrown in a pool when he can't swim, and then everything else early in his life is the war. So that is kind of his foundational memories, right? Instead of a normal, whatever that would be, normal childhood, all this man has to reflect on is being thrown in the pool as a child, and then experiencing the Second World War, and the very worst that the Second World War had, among the worst that the Second World War had to offer for American troops.
The patient was a prisoner of war in Dresden when it was bombed. He claims that well over 100,000 people were burned to death in the fire, worse than Hiroshima. And since Billy was actually there, it's natural enough to assume that this has had a contributing effect on his present condition.
So why do you think he was picked by the Tralfamadorians then to be a time traveller?
So in answer to that question, I would ask you, do you actually think that he was picked by the Tralfamadorians to be a time traveller, or he was picked by the Tralfamadorians because he's a time traveller? Because I am actually not convinced that it's totally clear in the film.
Ah, that's interesting. I always thought, until you just mentioned it now, that he was picked to be a time traveller because he's taken to that spot and then he's skipping through time. But that's just how I read it. It could be that he always had that ability. I don't know.
So what we have to assume from that is that he is not experiencing any slippage through time until he is abducted by aliens. And you think that there was an earlier example of that, but we're not quite sure where the earlier example lines up against the plane crash, because we know that he's experiencing time travel by then.
If we read it as in the way the film tells it, there is only the one moment when he's abducted, when we see him being abducted. And then from that point, he writes about this time slipping and this time tripping stuff that's happening to him. And he's writing the news report, and he's telling people about it. He tells his family about it, who think he's mental, because his wife's just died. They think it's because of all the trauma. But he's like, no, this is what's happening to me.
So my interpretation of it, both times I watched it actually, was that this is just something that happens to Billy and we're not given a reason for it. But that's what makes him an attractive candidate for abduction by the Tralfamadorians, because they're these aliens that live in the fourth dimension, and they exist only in time. So Billy can't even see them because they have no corporeal being. They're just these beings of time. And through that, they experience all time as one thing happening all at once, and they've got no concept of past, present, or future. Now, that is Billy's life. That's how Billy's lived his life. So that's what I was a little bit unclear on. I thought that he was just experiencing that, and that's why they chose him, because he's, as we've talked about before, he's equipped for it. He's got the skills to be abducted by the Tralfamadorians, because their whole philosophy is about time just being one continuous moment. And that's how Billy's been living, with these flashbacks to the war.
And also his life is so punctuated by these traumatic events. And there is like a circular nature to his life as well, because the fact that when he's in the war, he meets the guy who will kill him later on. And like that guy keeps saying like, one day you're going to get a knock on your door and it'll be me in a trench coat, until like Billy's giving this speech. And the guy who shoots him is the guy we saw in the first sort of like opening 10 minutes or whatever it is of the film. So it's got that nice sort of like book ending to it.
Yeah, this Paul Lazaro guy, who's just a real horrible piece of work, really kind of vicious American GI, who holds Billy responsible for the death of his friend. Which is very understandable given what we know they were going through at the time, those soldier characters. But as he's comforting his friend as he's dying, he's also recounting this story of when he murdered a dog in a really like horrible, violent way because the dog bit him. So Lazaro's like not a good guy, regardless of what he's gone through in the war. He's a pretty horrible guy, and he just keeps cropping up in Billy's memories of the war as this guy that just hates Billy and is sworn to kill him. So it's another example of us being introduced to a tragic event in Billy's life. And then as the audience, you just kind of have to wait for it to happen. It's a little less overt than other examples where, like his mother says that he was in Dresden, Dresden's going to get bombed. This is more like a character promises to do something. So you might not, on first viewing, assume that that's definitely what's going to happen at the end of the film. But at the same time, it's a tragedy that you get a sense is coming at the end.
But the film doesn't always focus on the tragedies. It shows us a lot of sort of like the nice things that he's like lived through, like when he got married and when he opened up, he opens up his own building or something like that. I can't remember exactly what it is, but he's got like lots of moments where he's happy and he's got his kids and his dog and he loves his dog and all this kind of stuff. And yeah, you see his entire life in the span of the film, but you see it in a really interesting way. And again, time travel is the way of telling this kind of story, this sort of non-linear narrative that makes it a really interesting watch.
In Tralfamador, where I presently dwell,
Life has no beginning, no middle, and no end. For example, many years ago, a certain man promised to have me killed. He's an old man now, living not far from here. He's read all the publicity associated with my appearance. He's insane. Tonight he'll keep his promise.
So that's about all we've got time for on Billy Pilgrim's life. And I feel like we're going to be reliving Billy Pilgrim's life for the rest of our lives, flashing back to that film. I really, really enjoyed that. And I thought that was great. So next week, we're going to be going from being unstuck in time to being stuck in time. What's the theme of next week's episode?
So next week's episode, we're going to be looking at time loops.
That's right, people who are trapped in time on a repeating cycle. So the first film we're going to be looking at is the comedy classic Groundhog Day from 1993. And then the second film is the more recent, maybe classic, Edge of Tomorrow from 2014. I'm really looking forward to rewatching both of those. I've seen both of those, and I'm guessing you have too. I know you well enough to make that guess, I'd say.
Yes, I've definitely seen both of these, but I'm looking forward to revisiting them because I'm sure there's lots of things that I missed in the first few viewings. And obviously when we sort of do these deep dives on these films, there's always more stuff to sort of uncover, and especially sort of focusing in on this idea of sort of time loops.
Yeah, that's going to be good fun. So join us next time for that. In the meantime, if you want to get in touch with us, please do drop us an email. It's journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com. You can find us on whichever social media platform is your favourite. Search for us, Journey Through Sci-Fi, and I'm sure you will be able to find us.
And when you do manage to find us, make sure you leave us a review and some lovely comments. We would love to hear from you. But that's it from us today. We'll see you next time.